Alright, so this one is going to need some context, so just bear with me here. So I try to keep things positive here, a sort of 50-50 split, so to speak. For every bad thing I say about a show, I say one good, and vice versa. It's a way to keep me sane as I look far too deep into cartoons, because this was the hobby I decided would be fun. I say that because this is not one of those videos. So let's just get into it. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your host Alexander, and we're going back to Family Guy to discuss, well, I will call it flanderization, but it's more just plain character assassination. Now, when it comes to Family Guy and the concept of character destruction, well, you could just name a character and you'd probably hit the mark somewhere. But despite the show's many faults, most characters on the show retain at least some semblance of what they originally were. For instance, Quagmire, who had the biggest character revitalization on the show, still occasionally shows signs of being a pervert. Brian, despite being turned into one of the most annoying characters on the show, still tries to be the voice of reason, so on and so forth. But then you get to Joe Swanson. Peter's arguably third or fourth best friend in the show, and also his personal resident suicidal human punching bag. And at one point, the heroic cop who also happened to just be a paraplegic. And that's what I want to talk about today. And just to reiterate, yes, today's topic is going to be on Family Guy. But like I said, I like to talk about the good and the bad in these videos. And despite my massive annoyance at the development of Joe's character, I fully intend to cover his good to the best of my knowledge and abilities. Now, with that being said, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to subscribe for more content. But with the nitty gritty out of the way, let's raise the curtain and look at the tragic downfall of Joe Swanson. Alright, so the best place to break down his character would be at the very beginning of his appearance in the show, which is actually the 5th episode of the first season, A Hero Lives Next Door. It's the first time we meet Joe, and it was the first introduction to the character, and if I'm being honest, it was the beginning of the end for it. And you want to know something? I hate that I can say that, and I hate the fact that a decent chunk of people would agree. But the fact is that this was Joe at his strongest character, not just in his first appearance, but primarily all these early seasons where Joe was something more than a joke. He felt like an actual character and less something that Peter and the gang could knock around for a quick laugh. He wasn't a punching bag, he was a cop who risked his life to thwart the Grinch from ruining Christmas. And yes, I know that's not the true story, but bear with me, we'll get there later. The point is, Joe used to be something. At one point in the show, he used to be the type of person that Peter would end up jealous of from time to time. And when he wasn't that, he was an actual friend. Think back to the time that Peter helped Joe train for the Special Olympics. And again, I know that Peter spiked Joe's drinks with steroids, but at the bare minimum, you could at least argue his intentions were pure. He didn't want to give him drugs, he just wanted to see his friend get his confidence back. But honest question here, could you ever see current Peter and Joe having this kind of relationship? Keep in mind, we're talking about the same Peter who just sent his friend to an insane asylum, but not before telling him that his favorite movie was terrible. And it's not like he didn't know that the asylum was terrible, he knew, he just didn't care. Joe became an inconvenience to him, so he shipped him off. And this weird character shift, it's something you notice with not just Joe, but also his entire family. In the earlier seasons, Bonnie was a quiet but loving wife that stuck by Joe despite his handicap. Now she's a self-entitled sociopath who would love nothing more than for her husband to either be murdered or to just kill him herself. It honestly depends on the episode. Meanwhile, the only person who I can say is still somewhat in character is Kevin. And that's less a praise about the commitment to his character and more like he had one sole trait and they reached its natural conclusion. Kevin was first and foremost a military bro, so of course he joins the military and he comes back with PTSD. It's not really character development so much as the natural course of what that joke would end up being. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's technically the end of Joe's character, and we still have to answer one serious question that happened in the middle of it, which is what caused the change? And while the answer could be answered with a few things, we're going to focus on what I think are the two main deciding factors. The first being the introduction of Susie Swanson. And I can probably guess what you're thinking, and yes, Susie is a nothing character. By definition, she has no real qualities. Her only real defining trait was that Bonnie's pregnancy with her was one of the series' running jokes, and even then those faded fast once the original writers realized the novelty wore off. But I would argue her debut episode did end up causing two drastic changes in Joe's character. The first being that this was the last time we saw Joe act more like a cop than the caricature of a cop that he became later in the seasons. This entire episode feels like the jumping point for turning Joe into the punchline that he ended up becoming. And for anyone who barely remembers this episode, and I assume there are a few of you because I barely remembered this episode before rewatching it, the main plot is that Susie is finally born after 7 to 8 seasons, give or take a season or two, because I'm not doing a recount, and if we're being honest, you don't care enough either. And at first, the Swansons are overjoyed, until Joe mentions that they can't afford to pay off the hospital bills that came with her birth. It's not the most engaging plot, but it does what it needs to get the job done. But looking back on it, I ended up noticing that the jokes in this episode were more, not funnier, but less cruel than what we normally get in the more recent episodes. So again, we're back to that question. What changed with Family Guy and Joe? And that brings us to the second and arguably the more important change in the show. That being the departure of Cleveland Brown.
What the hell? He's getting his own show?
And again, I'm gonna guess what you're thinking. What does Cleveland leaving have to do with Joe? Well, the thing is, when you go back and watch the older episodes of Family Guy, you start to notice that all Joe really did was take over the spot that Cleveland left behind. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but really go take a look at the older episodes of Family Guy and really pay attention to Cleveland's role in the show before and after his departure. In the earlier seasons, he's Peter's punching bag, someone who is so used to being abused that he doesn't even care that his house gets blown up on a semi-regular basis. He was a man with a job that was mentioned no more than 2 or 3 times, and yet most people couldn't even remember what he did before becoming a mailman. But the main point is that Cleveland, by all definitions, was kind of a failure. He was such a loser that his wife cheated on him with not only his best friend, but if we're also to believe what the Cleveland show said, nearly half of Quahog, before, during, and after their marriage and divorce. Now hold on to everything I just told you, and then switch over to Joe and you start to see what I mean. Virtually everything early seasons Cleveland was based on was essentially transferred to Joe's character in one way or another. Loretta and Bonnie are both cheating wives who seemingly hate their husbands for various reasons and then sleep with people close to them. Quagmire for Loretta and Brian for Bonnie respectively. Both also have children that only appear when a joke is needed for them and then sort of just fade out of existence. Though I will say that Cleveland Jr. had a much more prominent role in the Cleveland show than Kevin has ever had in Family Guy, but the point still stands. And then both have jobs that were either never relevant to the character or just slowly sort of phased out from their character over time. So with all that, we're still back to the major question of the video, which is what happened to Joe Swanson, and now the new more important question of why did it have to happen to him? And the answer to the first question simply seems to be that the show's writers just swapped Cleveland and Joe's places in the show's hierarchy once Cleveland left to keep the same momentum of the show going. They needed someone who could be bullied by Peter, and so they landed on Joe. So they did what they usually do and just slowly pushed him into the slot that Cleveland used to fill to make ends meet. But like most things in modern Family Guy, they ended up being pushed too far off the initial spectrum and ends up in that same realm as modern Squidward, that being the joke character used in the quote-unquote funny torture scenes. But that still leaves the other question on the table. So let's wrap this up and talk about why it happened to Joe. And unfortunately, that's where it gets complicated, because everything I just told you, everything I just explained in intense detail, it's all important and relevant, but it also doesn't matter in the slightest, because the truth is that it really all just came down to dumb luck. Now again, I know that seems crazy, but I can prove it by talking about one episode in particular, and that episode is Season 7's 8th episode, Jerome is the New Black.
We got us a black man.
Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this episode because the truth is you probably know a decent chunk about it. This is the episode that introduced Jerome to the series, firmly cemented the fact that Cleveland was gone at the time, and most importantly, created one of the most contentious rivalries in the show. That being the hatred between Glenn Quagmire and Brian the dog. And really, it's that part that I want to focus on because, believe it or not, this episode is what I mean when I say luck. See, when watching this episode, you may forget the fact that the original B plot for the episode wasn't Brian trying to get Quagmire to like him. It was actually about Brian trying to become the 4th person of Peter's drinking gang.
Oh, we're just trying to find a friend to replace Cleveland. We've been meeting people for the past 3 days.
Well, you don't need to look for somebody new. I'll hang out with you guys.
He wanted to fill the slot left by Cleveland's departure from the group. Now, normally that wouldn't be too interesting on its own, because Brian has on occasion been a drinking friend for Peter at the Clam, and he's done so with Peter and with the entire gang. But what's interesting here is the fact that this was also around a time that Brian was becoming, well, kind of a dick. Now, he wasn't quite as bad as what he currently is, but there's no denying that this episode was a stepping stone to that transition. Now again, what does this have to do with Joe? But hear me out. With Cleveland gone, someone needed to take over as both Peter's drinking buddy and as his punching bag. Brian didn't work because he was always more of Peter's house friend than his drinking friend. It's something the show goes out of its way to demonstrate time and time again. So they started to go down the list and find someone to take Cleveland's place. Quagmire couldn't work because they were already focusing on reworking his character into something less, well, less rapey.
Sweetie, how old are you?
16.
18? You're first.
Mom!
I like where this is going.
And Jerome couldn't work because he was too new of a character and his entire personality was being the type of guy who wouldn't take anything like that. But then you get to Joe, and you're presented with a character who, one, was already more of a background side character than a real one, and 2 was already being established as a character who, as we mentioned before, was also kind of a loser. When you mix that together with the fact that most of his best episodes were behind him and the writers were essentially casting him off to the wayside, and then you realize you have the perfect opportunity to turn him into the butt of every joke. And really, that's the main downfall of Joe. At the core of this issue is the fact that he was a character that even in the older seasons, the writers barely knew what to do with, and as time went on, he just became more and more obscure outside of being Peter's quote-unquote friend and drinking pal, until eventually he just took the place of another one-dimensional character. The funny thing is, looking back on this, there are times when it feels like the writers want to pull back on how they treat Joe. In some of the more modern episodes, they definitely pull back on the jokes and just put him in more absurd situations. But it also feels like they're so used to this way of writing for him that they really don't know how. So, if you really want to know the downfall of Joe, it's a one-dimensional character, barely given any screen time to try and become something else, mixed together with an absurd amount of bad luck and writers who really don't know how to fix him or change their style of joke telling, trying to force him into a role he was never meant for. So in the end, we're just stuck in this weird limbo with his character for better or for worse. And considering the way the show's been going for a while, it's definitely going to be worse a lot longer. But with that, we're going to close the curtain on the downfall of Joe Swanson. I gotta be honest, this is probably the most in-depth video for Family Guy I'll ever do. I originally started this with the intention to try and make a short video on the subject, but the more I delved into this, the more interesting it became. But as always, with the current closing, I'll leave you with just a single question this time. So how do you feel about Joe, both as a concept and as a character in the show? I'm curious to the reception because again, looking back on his character, it really feels like the writers only ever had a one-track mind when it came to him. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. As always, you can leave a comment down below, and if you enjoyed this video and want to stay updated on content, be sure to like and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter for more consistent updates. But until next time, I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.